Welcome to the Ethics of Science at Gabsmacked, where facts don't care about your feeling and periscope freezes whenever it feels like. So now we come to John Stuart Mill, and there's a reason Mill is actually remembered much more than Bentham is, right? What he said, what Mill said here, he said, propose as a single standard for morals and legislation based on two foundations. All right, number one, okay, here's foundation number one. The principle of utility as the normative foundation of his theory. He stated that the principle in the following way: actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the opposite of happiness, which is quite interesting. He mentioned the opposite of happiness. He didn't say sadness. That's one thing, which sort of implies in a way that it can be multi-directional. In other words, you can move away from happiness in many different directions, which is why he's saying the opposite of happiness. Because you can move away from happiness up this way. Oh, someone's offering me a job all of a sudden. It's interesting. So you can move from happiness this way or this way or this way, which is and that's another interesting concept. Because traditionally in the Judeo-Christian theory, that I'm not talking about currently, but the literal interpretation was that there was one place of hell and one place of heaven, as opposed to this idea of happiness being at the center and you can move further away from it. Right, which is quite interesting. So that was the first part. This is what Mill was proposing, right? And here we go. What's the next one? So he was saying that actions are right in proportion that they tend to promote happiness. That's not to be confused with pleasure, right? And what I mean superficial pleasure, right? So, if you go and play computer games and playing computer games makes you feel good and stimulates the pleasure senses, that is not making you necessarily happy. That is just alleviating depression. So that doesn't mean that that's the morally correct thing to do. This is what Mill is saying. Okay, the next thing he was saying is human nature affirms the basic human desire for unity and harmony with. Okay, he had an assumption, and this is interesting. This actually we do see a lot on college campuses these days. John Stuart Mill asserted a view of human nature that affirms a human desire for unity and harmony with fellow human beings. So his arguments are not listed here, right? So we're not getting into his arguments in detail, but he did assert a view of human nature that affirmed basic human desire for unity and harmony with fellow human beings. Now, on that assumption, then this idea of moving towards happiness with good laws and moving away with bad laws could work, because you would then say that there was some sort of morality that was, normative amongst all human beings. But that is a pretty damn big assumption, and not everyone agrees on that, right? It doesn't seem anyway on the surface that all humans have a desire towards unity. Yeah, exactly. It does sound like more of the collectivist doctrine. Exactly right. All right. Now, here we go. So the purpose of morality, according to these two foundations, is seen as promoting natural human sympathies and combating human limitations. Depends on the unit to many. Yeah, that's exactly right. Exactly, yeah. All right, Mill and other utilitarians believe the principle of utility is the best means to produce those ends. All right, so according to those hypotheses or those assumptions, actually, then Mill and other utilitarians believe that the utilitarian method, which was to apply laws that were utility focused, as opposed to morally focused, was the way to actually bring us towards a better and healthier civilization. It's a very interesting concept. I do see that a lot. Whether it's used or misused, I'm not sure, but we do see that a lot in collectivism these days, yeah. All right, even with school of thought, there is a disagreement on how to interpret the principle of utility. Bentham judged an action on its production of pleasure and non-production of pain. That's interesting. So we were just talking about happiness. Bentham was judging an action based upon its production of pleasure and non-production of pain. Well, sometimes pleasure and pain are mixed, right? We won't get into that. He attempted to quantify this throughout the group affected by the action using criteria such as intensity, duration, propinquity, extent, and certainty. That's quite interesting. So he then wanted to quantify what he was saying. How do you quantify pleasure? How do you quantify pain? How do you quantify happiness? How do you make a measurement stick for that? That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to create a science out of what people seem to think is innate to human beings. And that's actually quite interesting, because then if that would have worked, then it would have created a measuring stick. Too subjective. Yeah. Dodgy way of thinking, because you sometimes have to suffer to advance. That's exactly right. That's another good point. So sometimes, like you say, the idea of sacrifice, which is putting away something now for a net benefit in the future, is that taken into account with this measuring stick? That's exactly right. Very interesting. So he used, in the way that he tried to measure it, right, was intensity, duration, propinquity, extent, and certainty. I think that the certainty part is what really you would then put that sort of measurement into. The idea of having happiness in the future while sacrificing it in the present would go under certainty in this case, but it seems very ambiguous. All right, Mill tried to add a qualitative factor. So qualitative factor is like good, bad, as opposed to an actual degree, which is the quantitative factor. Doctrine of swine objection. Okay, here we go. If only quantity is measured, a satisfied pig could become the moral standard. So there you go. That's actually quite interesting. So Mill was arguing that if you just use quantity, then a satisfied pig could become the moral standard. That's quite interesting. Mill refutes this idea in his famous comment that, okay, here is his comment that refutes this idea. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Now, obviously, we're not getting into these in detail, so it's a shame that we can't discuss them in detail. But we're just learning, this is the four theories that we want to look at on the surface. This one is utilitarian theory of morality. Okay. The principle of utility can be applied in two ways. One is by act, and the other by rule. Okay? Act utilitarians judge the consequences of individual actions independently, while rule utilitarians use the principle of utility to justify moral rules, which are then applied to individual actions. That's interesting. That's quite interesting, because if you use that rule to apply to individual actions, you're going to end up with exactly what we have now, whereas people on the edges of society are unjustly treated, whether they are working class or whether they have mental illness or they have autism, etc., etc. All right, here we go. A rule utilitarian will obey a rule even in a situation where an act utilitarian would argue that breaking the rule would yield better consequences. That's interesting. So what's interesting is that you can see that utilitarianism can sort of eat itself, in the sense that now they are opposing each other in that subset of utilitarianism. The rule utilitarianism follows the rule. So even though they are talking about utilitarian theory where rules don't matter, but within that theory, or not rules don't matter, but they are not focused on. Within that theory, the subset is that the rules within that theory itself have to be followed if you are a rule-based utilitarian. And irrespective of the situation, they have to be applied. Whereas the other person, the act utilitarian, would say, no, it depends on the given situation. Which I find quite interesting, because if you go back to the Old Testament, look at the book of Judges. Basically, the way I read Judges is that it is an example of humans experimenting with how to apply laws, how to create laws, and how to figure out when the laws should or should not be broken, and to whom they should be applied, and in what degree. All right. Rule utilitarians argue that maintaining the ends justify the means kind of thing. Yeah, pretty much. But then how do you define what the end is? Rule utilitarians argue that maintaining the integrity of the rules and the whole system of rules is important to the social fabric. Okay, that's fair enough. So sometimes the price of that is that some people will be unjustly treated. And it depends on how far you deviate from the mean in a normal distribution of humanity, will depend on to what degree you will be unjustly treated. So like I said, people who are in the underclass, or people who have mental illness, or someone who's in an unbelievably rare situation, all of those, a law which works on rules will not be able to be applied as effectively. It's sort of like a sledgehammer as opposed to a surgical knife. Okay, so here are the critiques of utilitarianism. What's the bit? We've already come up with them, right? Okay, the first major critique, right, is the individual's ability to weigh unlike things quantitatively or qualitatively, as well as the individual's ability to weigh his or her own happiness equally with the happiness of others. All right, so that's quite interesting. To weigh unlike things, as well as the individual's weigh own happiness equally with. That's quite interesting. So, for example, maybe cocaine makes one person Too many variables, exactly. Too many variables. So, I don't know, like trying to think of another example, like lollies, right? Lollies might make you feel amazing and might make me feel not as amazing. But it could also be that me not as amazing is closer to my ideal happiness than you feeling amazing, because you need to feel super, super, super amazing to actually feel what you would consider happy. I've conflated pleasure and happiness, materialism versus fulfillment, maybe. Well, it could be, yeah, it could be. The idea of pleasure, which was Betham's version, versus Mill's of happiness, which happiness was different to pleasure, which we were saying, yeah. Here we go. Linked to the question is a pragmatic concern that even a person who has ability would have insufficient time to calculate every decision. That's quite interesting, where they're saying that each person given a specific situation would not have enough time to sit back and pragmatically calculate what should be done in a certain situation. But the other thing it doesn't factor in, which they haven't brought up here, is that people have different propensities to follow rules. Some people's brains do not work with rules at all, right? Mill has offered the rebuttal that conscience can be used as a rule of thumb to determine the rightness or wrongness of an action. So here the rebuttal to that argument, conscience can be used. Well, once again, does everyone have the same conscience? Where does it come from? Do we have it equally? Do we follow it equally? To me, I don't see that being the case, because, as I've said before, free will is apparently, according to every study out there and according to the laws of causality, an illusion in almost all of its forms. So if free will is an illusion and some people do bad and some people don't, then what is that that's making them make those choices? Right? And so you would argue that one of the variables is someone's sensitivity to their own conscience. And it makes sense, because the autist and the psychopath are on the opposite ends of the scale. Like the autist wouldn't take 1 cent from a billionaire. The psychopath would take $1 billion from someone who owns a cent, right? And they wouldn't give a damn. And then everyone else sort of is distributed along the way, so you can get pushed in a certain direction. In fact, there's a book about these guys in Nazi Germany. Oh, I've heard summaries of the book. All right, I'm going to have to continue this in a bit, unfortunately. I have one of my colleagues from work calling me. But I think I'm going to look up that book. I think it's called Ordinary Men. I think it's called Ordinary Men. Has anyone heard of that book? Ordinary Men. It's about some men who were just regular guys, and they were old enough to not get propagandized like teenage people do. Because, obviously, as the teenage brain, it's very malleable. But when you're in your mid to late 20s, it sort of becomes cemented. So you're sort of a bit more immune. But Ordinary Men, it's about these guys that were sort of older when Nazi Germany and the propaganda started. So they weren't really into the Nazi thing. But it shows you that once they joined the army, how they slowly but surely committed acts of atrocity, and how ordinary people can commit atrocious acts over time, inch by inch. And it shows you that it's potentially within all of us, at least 99.9% of us, to turn under certain situations, even for good reason. And in fact, that's probably why Breaking Bad was such a popular series, because it shows you how someone that is good through naivety, through both resentment and through other situations, can turn the path of good intent. Yeah, absolutely. Inch by inch, step by step. And it depends on every individual choice you make throughout the day, which is what leads you on whichever path. Yeah, absolutely. All right, we'll stop there, because I got to make some calls, and I'll come back and we'll do some more, and we'll see who shows up. Gabversity. Anyone subscribe? It's $1 a month to Patreon/Gabsmacked. Then I can do more and more lectures. Otherwise, I will go and work tonight, as always. Bye bye.